This is a list of major human impacts on marine ecosystems and coral reefs. We will be exploring the topics of estuaries, coastal wetlands, and coral reefs in this brief video lesson. Half of the coastal wetlands are lost to agriculture and urban development on the land that's adjacent to our coastlines and our marine environment. Over 1/5 of the mangrove forests have been lost to agriculture and development and shrimp farms since 1980. We also have issues with beaches eroding because of coastal development and rising sea levels. In addition to that, ocean bottoms are being degraded, the habitats, because of dredging and trawler fishing. At least 20% of the coral reefs are severely damaged and more than 33% are threatened. Other issues that are impacting our marine ecosystems include a general warming trend in our ocean waters with temperature, rising ocean acidity as a result of the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, soil erosion from adjacent land areas being flushed into our estuaries and direct coastal environments, algae growth from fertilizer runoff, coral bleaching, which I'm going to talk about in more detail as well. Estuaries are where rivers meet the sea. It's basically an area where saltwater and freshwater mixes together. There's a good mixture of nutrients from the watersheds that drain into the ocean, and unfortunately also the pollutants from the watershed that drain into the ocean. A coastal wetland is an area that's covered with water all or part of the year. Usually we find coastal wetlands in temperate zones, and we have our mangrove forest in tropical zones. Estuaries provide important economic, cultural, recreation, and ecological services. They help maintain water quality in coastal zones by filtering toxic pollutants, excess plant nutrients and sediments, and by absorbing other pollutants. They also provide food and habitat and nursery sites for a variety of aquatic and terrestrial species. And they can reduce storm damage and coastal erosion by absorbing waves and storing excess water produced by storms and tsunamis. And finally, estuaries and coral reefs and coastal wetlands represent some of the world's most productive ecosystems at a similar level of tropical rainforest and inland wetlands. Let's talk about the Chesapeake Bay Estuary. It's an area near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that the Susquehanna River feeds into, where freshwater and saltwater mix to create a very productive estuary. It's considered to be the largest estuary in the United States and stretches more than 200 miles long from Havre de Grace in Maryland to Virginia Beach in Virginia. It can be 4 miles wide to 30 miles wide at different areas along the stretch of this estuary. It is considered to be the third largest estuary in the world and has over 11,684 miles of shoreline. This is more than the entire west coast of the United States. The estuary is unique because of its shallow depth of up to 21 feet or less, and there are areas in the estuary that if you were a 6-foot tall person, you could easily wade through more than 700,000 acres of the bay and never get your hat wet. Hence, it is shallow. There are more than 150 major rivers and watersheds that empty into the bay, and obviously any water quality or land use associated with those watersheds can feed into the bay and cause potential environmental impact. Hence, the bay watershed is huge. Since 1973, the Endangered Species Act has served as a way to protect plants and animals that are in danger of becoming extinct. More than 2,300 species are listed on the Endangered or Threatened Species list at the federal level of the U.S. government. Several of these species depend on unique habitats that are found in the Chesapeake Bay in order to survive. Here are a few highlights. The top right picture is the dwarf wedge mussel. The dwarf wedge mussel. If these bivalves went extinct, the bay would sorely miss them. Besides purifying the water from bacteria, harmful algae, and metals, their shells also provide habitat for many of the bay's smaller creatures. Unfortunately, freshwater mussels are one of the most endangered species in the world. They have faced threats since the 1800s, when their shells were very popular for pearl buttons. Now the threats are more indirect. Nutrient pollution from the land and subsequent low oxygen zones can destroy their habitats and suffocate them. The middle picture is a picture of the North Atlantic right whale. Unlike many whales, right whales prefer to hug along the coastlines, a fact which makes them much more vulnerable to human disturbance. In the past, excessive whaling caused their populations to plummet, and until today, there were only 300 to 400 left in the western North Atlantic. Now, they're more often killed while accidentally getting entangled in nets or in collisions with ships. November typically marks the beginning of their winter migration, a dangerous time when they migrate south to give birth to their calves. During the migration, some pass by the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. To help protect whales on their journey, NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association, National Marine Fisheries Service, created mandatory speed limits for large ships in certain areas, including the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. The picture at the bottom is the leatherback sea turtle. This is considered the world's largest turtle and largest living reptile. It can stretch 6.5 feet long and can weigh as much as a small car. It's also the only sea turtle without a hard shell. Though leatherbacks generally stick to the open ocean, they rely on beaches to make their nest for their eggs, and some have been found in the lower part of the Chesapeake Bay. Today, both land and sea have become dangerous to these turtles. On shore, the eggs, the juveniles and adults, risk being harvested, and at sea they can often find themselves inadvertently trapped by fishing gear. So 3 species in particular that are considered endangered in the watershed include the leatherback sea turtle, the right whale, and the dwarf wedge mussel. On the left side of the screen is a diagram depicting the extent of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. This is the Chesapeake Bay in this location, and the watershed reaches into Delaware, up through Pennsylvania, into New York, over into West Virginia and Virginia. The Chesapeake Bay is the first estuary to be targeted for restoration as a result of the water quality decline over the years. Over 3,600 species of plants and animals thrive in the Chesapeake Bay watershed region. 29 species of waterfowl year-round rely on this area. 87 species of waterfowl rely on this area during winter migration, and there can be over 100 million waterfowl that stop to feed and rest on the bay during the winter months along the Atlantic Migratory Bird Flyway. Bay oysters were once so plentiful they could filter the entire quantity of water in the bay. More than 18 trillion gallons of water in less than 3 days. Today, because of oyster depletion, this task would take over a year. The biggest source of nitrogen pollution in the Chesapeake Bay is agricultural runoff, which accounts for about 41% of the nitrogen pollution in the bay, mostly due to animal waste that runs off the land in the watershed and fertilizers that's applied to farm fields in the watershed. There are lots of pollutants to consider, but nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment are the most damaging, which cause algal blooms and oxygen-depleted zones throughout the year. The good news is that the blue crabs are doing okay. They're doing better. We had experienced a large decline in blue crab population prior to the 1980s, but between 2012 and 2013, the abundance of spawning age female blue crabs in the bay increased 51%. A sustainable blue crab stock means more stable bay economy, and this increase in blue crab abundance is a sign that the sustainable management methods for the bay are definitely working. As indicated on your slide, the Chesapeake Bay produces more than 500 million pounds of seafood per year, and although I mentioned that the blue crab harvest was recovering, we did have a record low blue crab harvest in 2014. And just to reiterate, the largest source of nitrogen pollution in the bay is stemming from agricultural runoff.